right, Leland. Welcome again to the JCS Show. For anyone who's watching, we did an episode a while back, maybe a year ago. Um, so I'll link below to that episode. You can go check it out. But the general context is we grew up together. Our families were friends. We went to the same schools. I'm friends with your brother. You're friends with my sisters. So we've known each other a long time. And we've just got similar interests. So as we've gotten older, we've just kind of bonded over our shared interests and interested in psych. We're interested in fitness, um, philosophy. And so we kind of bridge those subjects from one to the next and use analogies to blend them all together. So that's kind of what I'm expecting out of this conversation, just hopping around talking about, uh, yeah, everything that comes to mind. But how you been, man? How things going?
That's a pretty good introduction. I've been great. I'm looking forward to talking with you again. I really enjoyed our discussion last time, and I have more content in each of those areas, as I'm sure you do. Looking at the bookshelf behind you, got a couple new books on there, and I'm looking forward to picking up and offering some more insight into those areas.
Yeah, man. I can at least pretend I've read some of those books, but
Yeah, you're saying the second tier of the shelf is you start to get a little bit less
yeah,
knowledgeable, but the
yeah,
first the first tier you got
yeah,
you got locked down.
yeah. That upper row, I got down for sure. um,
Nice.
but yeah, man. So I always think that the memory training you do is that's kind of the unique thing that you're really into that I don't know anyone else who's into. So let's start there. And I know we kind of went over it before, but just assuming that some people haven't watched that full episode, can you give me a brief rundown on what memory training is, how it kind of works from a macro level, and how you got into it and what you do with it?
Yeah, sure. So the basic premise is that our brain is designed to be really good at remembering certain things and not other things. So throughout evolution, it was really important to remember where the food was, where key landmarks were, where all these important spatial details were, and we got really good at remembering stories. And so we built up our brains in this environment that rapidly changed in the last 2,000 years. And so we still have a lot of elements of our psychology that are wired for storytelling, that are wired for spatial memory. And we're living in a 21st century environment that's completely different. And so what my training is all about is taking advantage of our brain's natural abilities to remember in a certain way and applying that to allow people to remember new information like languages, or if they're in medical school diagrams, studying for tests, or even older adults, I'll give them brain exercises so that they can train their memory using some of these concepts to have a better memory as they age.
Can you explain to me, like, say you're in medical school, and I know you've worked with a lot of medical students over the years, but say
Yeah.
you're in medical school, like, how is the information structured, and how does that differ from the narrative spatial based memory that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the demonstrations I love giving is I'll just pull up a diagram of the brain or something that somebody would see in a class and their teacher would say, okay, good luck, learn this, and we'll have a test on it next week. And I just give this to medical school students and I just ask them, like, so how are you going to approach this? And I always get a different answer, which is kind of interesting because everybody has their own approach to some extent. I believe that, but it's also like there are certain principles you can follow where people should be coming to a similar conclusion, but they're not. So they'll get a diagram like this and they won't necessarily know how to approach it. And it's all just facts and titles, names, that sort of thing. And they just have to commit to memory. And so what they typically end up doing is they'll get flashcards or Quizlet, and they'll use rote repetition to try to sort of beat the information into their brains. And they're so smart that it does work eventually, but it takes a lot of time. And so what my strategy is about is creating stories and turning some of these some of these different pieces of information into like characters. And so if you know anything about like mnemonics, you kind of know, like you can take a word and you can think like, what is this? Well, what does this sound like? What's a word that's similar to it? And you can come up with an image for it. And then you can start to build stories around it. And so I show people how to do that in an effective way so that the studying is more effective and it's also more fun, because it's just not that fun to drill information in your head. Even if it does work, you're spending a lot of time and you start to resent some of the studying you have to do.
And then just to kind of round it out a little bit, can you give me an example? Like, let's say, like you mentioned brain. Let's say we're trying to understand the amygdala. Like, how would you memorize A, that word, and then B, some of the functions of the amygdala using the memory techniques if you're working with a medical student?
Yeah, exactly. So like the amygdala is, we're talking about the fight or flight kind of instinct. Amygdala is associated with fear, and fear memories specifically. And one thing that we would do is like a very simple mnemonic for it is, you get like somebody you know named Amy or something, just like off the top of your head, you know, somebody named Amy, and like she's kind of stressed out, maybe she's drinking a lot of coffee, and so she has this like this fear kind of thing going, right? And so suddenly we've taken this word that has no context for us and we've attached it to something that we do know, which is a person with a personality. And so that's kind of what I meant about leveraging things our brain is really familiar with to help us cross into new territory.
Okay. So Amy is kind of like the first part of amygdala. So it's
Exactly. Yeah.
and then you've got a stressed out Amy, and that kind of helps you lock in that the Amy part of the brain, the amygdala part of the brain is okay. Cool.
Yeah, and it's definitely like really personal too. So one of the mistakes that I used to make when I was coaching people is I'd give them too many examples, and I realized I was holding them back because it really needs to come from you. Like you might not know somebody named Amy, or that might not be a good association for you. So one of the things that people miss if they're relying on other people's analogies or other people's memory techniques is they miss the creative process of forming their own association. So that's really important.
And how do you get to that personal level with your clients? Like, let's say it was me trying to remember amygdala and I didn't have anyone that I knew personally named Amy. Like, what kind of strategies would you employ for a client like that?
Yeah, I would ask them to really start with the first association that comes to mind. And this is something that I think distinguishes me from myself a couple years ago, because when I used to teach mnemonics, I would really try to drill down and come up with an image for every part of the word. Like let's find amygdala, we'll have Amy for the first part and then something for the Bella part at the end. And I would really obsess over it. But what I realized over time is it doesn't really matter that much. You're using this mnemonic just to get your foot into the door for learning about the brain. It's not it's not something to obsess over. What you're doing is you're just building some associations so that you can grasp the information more easily, and so you'll be able to learn and work with the information more quickly. And other associations will start to form. So it just kind of speeds up the initial familiarity and learning process. And you don't have to obsess too much about having the perfect association for each person.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is Amendola, the Patriots and Bills receiver, Danny Amendola. But I would
Yeah,
probably just
exactly.
picture him like running from Ray Lewis all stressed out or something like that.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah.
how
And
I personally remember it.
that's something I'd never come up with. And so that's a great example. Like I have
Yeah.
no idea who that is.
he was kind of like that Wes Welker type, like the little slot receiver back. I think he was on the Patriots when they won against the Falcons, that big comeback, but it's beside the point. But
I'll just nod like that
yeah.
was that, like that made it clear for me.
Sports.
Yeah. Just like Wes Welker. Yeah. Obviously. Now I get it. Yeah, now I get it.
Cool. So real quick, just what are some of your personal accolades in the memory world? I know that you've done some impressive things. So like, what do you personally do when you've trained in the past? What are some of the your personal records, just to give any viewers a kind of a sense for how you've incorporated that?
Yeah, so I've mostly moved on from competing in memory events. One of my best events was always word memorization, and I got really quick with it because I was practicing French at the time. And so it was like I was able to train for a word memory competition, but it was really just me learning French vocabulary. And so I ended up being able to memorize about 70 words in a minute in English, just random English words. And that was kind of the peak of my word memorization because that was when I was learning French vocabulary over that summer. When I skipped 4 years of French by memorizing a bunch of vocabulary and grammar, etc. And so because I was doing that every day, I got really, really good at words. And I would say that's still one of my strongest memory things. I also had a phase where I got interested in memorizing pi, and I started picking up thousands of digits of pi. Um, but that's a little different because that's more of a test of, I would say that's more like an endurance test than a sprint. In a lot of these memory competitions, the cool part about it is the information will be totally random. And so they'll say, how many random numbers can you memorize in 5 minutes? And you've never seen it before. When I was memorizing pi, I realized a lot of people, it was not really that they were good at memory techniques. It was just they spent more time than me. So that was kind of like a self-defeating thing where I was like, all right, maybe I don't need to spend my whole summer on this.
Yeah, that's actually interesting to think about the difference of the sprint versus the endurance because, as you
Yeah.
know, I'm training for my first 50K, which is an endurance race. And honestly, you probably remember the last race I did was in Maine when we were kids, and it was that or what's it
Was it
what's
the
it
ice
called?
cream race?
Yeah, the ice cream race. It was a 5K. And I
Yeah.
remember that summer I had a walking boot since I'd messed up my foot. So I ran a 5K in a walking boot. Like
I remember that.
it must have been over 10 years ago. But that was the last race I did, and then I just signed up for 50K. Um, so that's what I've been training for. But I've noticed probably some of the same kinds of things you've noticed. Transitioning from sprint memory to endurance memory. It's just transitioning from sprints. I've always played sports, ball sports mostly, and it's all sprint focused, And now I'm training for this long race, and it's a whole different thing. Like I thought it would just be like the same thing for longer, but it's not. It's a completely different thing. Um, but yeah, I'm mentioning that now. It'll probably come up later. But I wanted to shift and talk about your fitness since I've always admired your fitness routines. I've learned a lot from you, and I'm the trainer. I'm the one who's certified, whatever that is good for. But yeah, I think that you've got a lot that I've learned from, and yeah, just to kind of give the people a rundown. What do you do for your fitness training? It's kind of unorthodox, but you're super strong, and I think it's cool that even when you go to the orthodox lifts, that strength transfers over from your unorthodox routines. But yeah, what does your fitness training look like these days and in years past?
So right now, it's very simple, and I really only do like 5 things for fitness, and I try to just do them extremely well. And so sprints is the first thing I do. L sits or some kind of hold for my abs, and then a lot of single leg, like Bulgarian squats, pistol squats, um, and then maybe some jumping, and that's pretty much it. And so my strategy has been to do more of these kind of compound athletic movements and try to just overload them and hope that they end up transferring well to other areas. So it's not that sophisticated right now, maybe as it has been in the past. But that's kind of where I'm at. Yeah.
I heard a saying one time that perfection is when there's nothing else to remove, but it seems like you've kind of come up with what for you is maybe not the perfect routine. You can always improve it, but you've cut a lot of a lot of the stuff that wasn't really serving you. But I'm interested. So you do these workouts, and you didn't mention anything with, you don't do bench press, you don't do shoulders, you don't do bicep curls. At least you didn't mention any of that. But um, and I know soccer is your sport mainly these days. But when
Yeah.
you're on the soccer field, like, how do your athletic abilities compare to the people that maybe go to the gym and do more of the traditional, you know, bench, squat, deadlift, push press, whatever they do, or hit the machines. You know what people do.
Yeah. So I would say with soccer, that helps provide more context because that is what I'm training for. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't do a lot of upper body stuff and I'm more focused on legs because adding upper body mass doesn't really help me very much. I'm trying to get faster, I'm trying to get more agile. So I would say people that are traditional gym goers are typically not training like athletes. And so a lot of the lifts that they get good at just slow them down. And so it's actually kind of to the point where I'll see kids that are like kind of skinny, like don't go to the gym. And it's like they're a lot scarier than like a meathead that's always doing bench press or always doing curls because they're just not training their body to be athletic.
It's interesting. And I've kind of noticed the same thing. I always think of it as the people who are doing compound lifts versus bodybuilding lifts, and the bodybuilding splits and more like there's chest day, back day, push pull, um, and maybe there's arms separate, and then they'd have like a leg day that some of them might hit every once in a while. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I've noticed like the people who do the bodybuilding, like they get bigger, and that's, I mean, if that's what you're going for, that's cool. But I do jujitsu amongst other things, and I've noticed that sometimes I'll go against a guy who's a successful bodybuilder, someone who's put on tens of pounds of mass of just bodybuilding, um, doing their bodybuilding splits, building it up over years,
Mhm.
getting really big, accomplishing the exact goal they're going for. But
Yeah.
and I'll be much lighter. Like they'll have 50 pounds on me sometimes, but they don't really feel that strong. Like in those jujitsu positions, like
Yeah.
like they look intimidating. And sometimes I'm like, oh man, this guy's gonna smash me. And then once I actually feel the strength, I'm like, this guy's not really that much stronger than I am. I'm skinny compared to him, but like since I train more like you do, I do a lot of compound stuff. I get very creative. For me, training is mental as much as physical. So I'm always trying to come up with new lifts, and it's probably not the most advantageous thing for my physical development, like to
Yeah.
constantly be like starting over with some new lift that I just invented this morning. But that's just for me.
Yeah.
That's part of the fun of it. Like I love coming up with new stuff and just
Yeah. It keeps
feeling
you
different
going
ways
with
my
the
body's moving.
novelty.
Yeah, exactly. I've always been
Yeah.
novelty seeking, just as my
Yeah. So
personality.
I'm kind of the opposite where I'm just as boring as possible, same thing over and over again. So for example, with Bulgarian squats, you remember when we did them together in Baltimore
Yeah, that was
out
probably
front?
18 months ago,
Yeah.
something like that.
So I used to do those with like 30-pound weights with you at that point. Um, Now I have these two 150-pound dumbbells that I hold in each hand, and I do sets of 8, and
That's
it's
crazy.
and my forearms get jacked from from holding the
Yeah,
weights. Actually, when I first started doing the Bulgarians, I had to just hold the weights and just practice doing that to build my way up to actually be able to do a workout because my grip strength was too weak to hold the weights for long enough. So that was like the limiting factor. Um, so yeah, I do them with 250s now, 300 pounds Bulgarian squats right over here. Actually, I'm looking at my weights right now. And it's great. And I've done Bulgarian squats every day for probably 2-3 years. Maybe taking like a couple days off. But that's kind of my approach to fitness where there's not a lot of novelty. There's just a few exercises and I track it and then I just keep making it harder and harder until it's kind of a freak level ability in these 5 exercises. And then I just hope like it'll transfer to something else.
yeah. How do you
Yeah.
maintain that consistency? Like, what do you have a routine where you do it at the same time every day, or do you have a checklist that you're just motivated to check that box every day, or have you just been doing it so long that's just like what you do? You find the time whenever it fits in your schedule each day. How does that work?
Yeah, I've really built up the habit of doing it. And this is something that I talked to one of my friends about who's just getting into working out. I was telling him in these beginning stages, if you can just work out every day, it's not about the fitness you're developing, it's about the habit of doing it. And that's way more important than how each individual workout goes. Is, are you building this into your routine? Are you able to become a person that's able to do this every day? And then after that, you can look at like the specifics of what you're doing, and you can try to make it more fine-tuned, etc. But for me, that's really worked, is just doing it every day. Then it no longer becomes a question of whether or not you're going to work out. It's more a question of like, how sore am I? How hard can I go? maybe I'll take it back a notch. But that's one of the reasons why for me I work out every day, is you don't really have the question of whether or not you're going to do it anymore. And it's also why I keep the exercises so simple. So I don't really have to think that much. I'm just, same thing. So it is probably not optimal to be so bland and kind of the same thing over and over again, but it's worked for me. So anyway.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing with clients and with myself, but I try to get the habit established first. And then with clients, it's a little different because like my income to an extent is tied to it, so I want
Yeah.
them to be consistent, A, like primarily so that they can be happy and healthy and all that, but B, so that they keep paying their invoices. But
Yeah.
yeah, I find that it's best to start with whatever they like. Like people who've done sports in the past, like have them do a wall sit and toss a tennis ball around or whatever, like just find whatever that person is super into. There was one lady I had, and she was like a power walking. Like she did competitive power walking when she was in high school. Like she was an older lady. It was 40 years prior, but I'll just have her do power walking sets in between like the more boring stuff,
Yeah.
and that just got her engaged. Like she would show up, and every single time she was consistent. She developed a routine, and then once they have the routine, I'll start to change it to more what I think that they actually need to work on to get towards their physical goals, whether they're trying to lose
Yeah.
weight, build strength, promote injury prevention, whatever that is. But first, you got to establish that habit, because if you're not going to come in consistently, then you're not going to want to do the hard things that you actually have to reach your goals.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. Do you pay attention to nutrition a lot when it comes to training, or do you just kind of eat whatever?
I kind of eat like whatever, but it's not like junk food. Yeah.
Yeah,
But I don't fine tune it nearly as much as I should, and as much as some people do. Definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm kind of the same at this point, honestly. I just mainly avoid processed foods, try to eat high protein, low sugar, but
Yeah.
that's it. Like that's I don't know. Some of my buddies are really they dial it in and track it.
Yeah.
And that's great. Like if you're trying to be as efficient as possible, tailoring your diet to your goals, then that you got to track it all. But I don't know. For me, some days I'm just hungry. Other days I'm not so hungry, but I just try to make sure I hit my minimum protein threshold every day, and that's it.
Yeah. I think I feel mixed about that, because there are times when I do track my workouts pretty closely, and my nutrition and that sort of thing. But there is also an element of opportunity cost for me when you start to fixate a little too much, where it's like the time I spent fixating on getting my nutrition dialed in, on getting these things, constantly paying attention to each thing I'm eating, and constantly writing down my workouts. Like there is kind of a cost to that, even if it is optimal, that you don't incur when you're not doing those things. And so I'm not saying that those things are bad. Like obviously it's probably worth it and it's probably good. But there are times when I'm like, when I'll be tracking my workout, I'm like, well, I'm writing in a book right now when I could just still be working out. And so I sometimes there are benefits, and sometimes there are also risks, I guess, to becoming a little too obsessive.
Yeah, I honestly feel the same thing. I've been into what I call like prehab lately, where especially now that I'm running for this race, I've been doing a lot for my hips and ankles because I think I had a labrum issue in my hip before, and I, in my mind, if I injure something training for this race, it's probably going to be one of my Achilles because that's where I feel the tension accumulate as I
Mm.
get deeper and deeper into my run. So I try to do a lot of prehab, like what would be rehab, but without actually injuring myself for those two areas in particular. But the way I do it is it's not like I do a 30-minute prehab workout. I'm in the gym all the time since I'm a trainer. And then I've got a gym set up in my garage. I've got a couple things here in my room. So pretty much my entire environment has equipment for me to use. And so I just try to get these little prehab sets in. But if I spend 5 minutes, you know, tracking what I ate for lunch, then that's going to take away from one of my prehab sets for the day, you know?
Yep,
So yeah, it's all about
exactly.
the opportunity cost, but it's also taken me a long time where I've built up the knowledge and just sort of the feel for what foods work for me, what foods don't, so that I don't actually have to think about it. I don't actually have to track it. I've tracked it in the past,
Yeah,
and I can kind of toggle, and I know, oh, I didn't yesterday. I must not have eaten that much because today I feel the way I do, and so
yeah.
I'll make the adjustment today, but I don't have to like sit down and write about it. Um,
Yeah.
Interesting. So, yeah, tell me, shifting gears, tell me what have you been working on lately? What have you been reading about? What have you been studying?
Yeah, sure. So again, this kind of comes back to me having five things for fitness that I focus on. I also have very specific interests that are always going to be the same. If you ask me a year from now, there'll be five more books in each of those areas. One of the things I'm interested in right now is I've really gotten interested in Chopin's music. And I've become a little obsessive about learning all of his life's work, just like over 250 pieces. And I just go through and try to learn as much as I can. I'd say I'm like a third of the way through that right now. But I've really been obsessed. And kind of to relate to what we were just talking about with hyper analyzing things and tracking food, etc., is I've been reading these books about Chopin's work, and they're these academic articles that analyze each measure of his piano, and they're like hyper focused on every little detail about when he wrote it. And it kind of reminds me of that, where it's like, maybe Chopin wasn't like didn't become that great because he was an analyst. Maybe he just kind of sat down at the piano and he was like, "Oh, this sounds great," and then and then it happened to check out with all the academic theory later on that these people came up with.
Yeah,
But just kind of connecting it to how like we love to try to like analyze and control, and there's an element where you can like learn from that and you can benefit from that, but then there's also this like intuitive creativity and genius as well. And so sometimes I'm reading these books and I'm like, I don't know if he was like thinking on that level or thinking about that. I think he might have just kind of felt that one and went with it just from his experience. It might have been a little bit more opaque. So
yeah.
anyway.
I remember hearing a quote from one author. I think it was Robert Frost. That's just sort of my best guess, but it could have been someone else. But they were saying I didn't even know what I meant until people started analyzing it after I wrote my pieces. But same kind of thing. Like they weren't like trying to put in all these crazy analytics into what they were writing. They're just writing what came to their mind, and then everyone else is attributing all these deeper meanings to their work, and they're just like, oh yeah, that I guess that checks out. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so when you say
For sure.
you're going through Chopin and you're a third of the way through his life's work, like what does it mean to go through one of his 250 pieces? Like what does that mean exactly?
So that's a good question because I I consider through to a point where I feel like the piece is like close to perfect, and then it's like a matter of picking up another one. So I'd say I'd have like a third of those where I'm not like so bothered by how I played it that I'm like, okay, I can work on something else now. But I never really feel with anything like I'm like done or if it's perfect. Usually like I'll play something and then afterwards I'll have like a mental checklist of like 30 little things that I was like, maybe I'll do that a little bit differently. And then once the checklist gets down to like one or two, then I'm like, all right, this is getting close. Yeah. And then if it hits zero, it's like a miracle. like wow, I crushed that.
That's crazy.
But it's rare. It's very rare.
And then as you're going, like, what is your sense of Chopin? Like, I've messed around with music a little bit, but nothing in depth like that. So what is it? And all the music that I've studied and been into has been lyrics. So that there's words in English, sometimes Spanish, but almost always in English. And so it's just like reading a book, and if you read an author, you kind of get a sense of their life and their emotional state as they went through the ups and downs of life. But what's it like going through that with an author? Or with the musician? Is it the same thing as an author? Like, how do you understand Chopin now after going through years of his work compared to at the beginning when you'd heard it, but you didn't really have the full context that you're building now?
I will say first about the lyrics part. One thing that's interesting is that for Chopin's pieces, he didn't even want there to be a title that indicated what it was supposed to be about. And a lot of those titles came from other people that just thought it kind of sounded like that. So they'll say, "Oh, this is, this situation, or this is a raindrop, or this is this." But Chopin would never do that, and he wanted his audience to have the flexibility to imagine whatever they wanted to when they were playing his pieces. So definitely a little bit more subtle than some modern music where they just tell you this is exactly what it's going to be up front. Now there's different categories. So there's waltzes, there are these polonaises. There's different like types of music, nocturnes that he plays, um, and each one has its own characteristics. And what's been cool going through it is over time you just start to get a really close familiarity just from playing the quantity of it. And I think now I would play very differently some of the pieces that I played like a year ago or a year and a half ago, just because I've had so many more experiences with his music where I feel like I can express things differently and I understand his intent more because I've seen a similar thing show up so many times.
If you're learning a new Chopin piece, like let's say you've studied the first half, or you're looking at the first half, you're playing through the first half, and you've never seen the second half of the piece, like do you have a sense of where it's going, or is it still like you're figuring it out as you go? Like do the patterns kind of lock in where you're studying and you're like, oh, I see like the progressions that he's going to go through going forward, or as you go, is it still like a surprise?
Yeah, so I would say because I've listened to all of his music, it's never really a surprise, and I always listen with a score in front of me so I can connect the notes on the page to what I'm hearing. So I'm able to kind of visualize whenever I listen, like what the score is going to look like and what it would look like on the piano. So we can't really do the experiment of would it be would it be a surprise or not because I've already kind of passed that phase. Um, but one thing that is really characteristic of his music is that he really has the ability to just drop you in like a completely different world. almost out of nowhere. And so it's like a predictable unpredictability of how he can totally just change the tone. And suddenly you're like, oh, did I just cross a different different corner, and now I'm in a totally new neighborhood and everything's different. So he's very good at shifting like that, which is what makes his music so unique for sure.
That's cool. Why Chopin? Like, why not Mozart, Bach? What do you like about Chopin specifically?
One of the things about Chopin is that he is a piano music only composer, really. And that was one of the pieces of criticism he got, because everybody wanted him to write for all these different instruments and be the next great composer for everything. And he said no, and he consciously rejected that. And within the piano, he was able to create such an elaborate form of his own world within that. And I think it really shows in his pieces that he was so dedicated on mastering this instrument specifically. Um, so I consider him to be the best composer for piano specifically. And just the level of sensitivity and sophistication of his pieces, I think, is pretty much unmatched. But I'm very biased, so yeah.
Earlier, you were mentioning about your fitness training, how you've kind of chunked it up into, and these are the chunks I can remember easily since this is my world. But you've got your core, your L sit type stuff, your single leg squats, your sprints, jumps. Um, do you break your Chopin, your music practice into similar kinds of chunks? Like, and how does your daily music practice kind of compare? What are the parallels, and where does it differ from your fitness practice?
It is much better than my fitness fitness practice. It's definitely much more targeted and disciplined towards specific things that I'm trying to work on, and it's much more intellectually sophisticated than just my fitness kind of regimen. But probably because my fitness is so simple and these other things are so simple, then I have more mental brain power to like focus on other things. Um, with Chopin specifically, there's a lot of technical patterns that repeat. So a lot of the same things come up. So it's like if you master them in one place, you'll have them further on when you're playing. And so one thing that I've noticed is there's this effect where even though I'm only like 30% through or whatever, probably even less than that, I am faster at learning new things because it'll be a similar pattern in the future, just expressed in a different way, if that makes sense. Um, and I like to focus on first. I'll like learn everything, and I'll just go through it. But then I'll focus on like what are the really hard parts of this, and how can I break them down so that it's less of a leap.
Do you work? I remember you used to work with that piano instructor Leo, who's affiliated with the Baltimore Orchestra, right? Um,
He's a Baltimore Choral Arts Society.
okay, but do you still work
Yeah.
with him, or are you sort of on your own doing your own thing at this point?
I do work with him, and he's been very very helpful. Yes, we have great discussions like this on learning and music, and you should have him onto the podcast.
Yeah, honestly, that's I'll remind you later, but I, I've heard a lot about him over the years, just since you've talked about his learning principles, and then we've applied them to the different things that uh, we've been working on over the years. But yeah, I would love to take you up on making that introduction. But yeah, so I just want to understand a little bit better, like whether it's with Leo or whether it's with yourself. Like, how do you decide what you're gonna do? Like, let's say you're sitting at the piano for an hour, or however long you train for. Like, it's for me. I know when I go to the gym, like I'm gonna do full body, so I'm gonna try to get squat, hinge, push, pull, carries, rotate, um, and then cardio on top of that. And I try to hit those throughout my days, throughout my weeks. But how do you like? What chunks do you break up music into? Is it, or is it just all just like one piece at a time going forward, or is there different aspects that you blend together? Like you mentioned that you like to study the piece, listening to it, and visualizing it. So I would consider that like one type of training, whereas practicing
Mm.
the whole piece would be maybe another type of training. Practicing the difficult parts, the parts with the most friction, will be a third type of training. But this is just me trying to chunk up what you're saying. How do you think of the chunks?
Yeah, I would say there's another part to this, which is it depends on what stage the piece is in. And so the initial stage, the practice will be very different than the polishing phase. So the initial phase, I'm really just reading the music and playing it very slowly so that I have a good technique and I'm not just quickly playing it wrong and ingraining the bad pattern. So the initial phase is very slow, deliberate. It's mostly focused on accuracy, and then I shift from accuracy to speeding it up a little bit, adding more sensitivity to the interpretations,
What
and
does that mean
maybe
exactly? Sensitivity.
adding more, just more depth to it, and thinking about how I'm playing a little bit more, because I'm no longer thinking just about where my hands are going to go in the piece. Like that phase is done, so it opens my brain up to think about more of how I'm actually going to be playing it, as far as like the dynamics,
Gotcha.
and the tempo, that sort of thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the dynamics and the tempo will be the technicals, but would it be fair to say that's like the emotional expression stage of the?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, it's like anything. Like your brain has a finite capacity, and the more you're able to master just the nitty gritty of the skill, the more you're going to free up space for your brain to do more with the emotions, or more to make a little flourish on top of that base.
This might be an impossible question to answer, but when you're playing a piece that you've rehearsed a million times and you're super familiar with it, like what are you thinking about as you're performing? Are you, because you're not like, you're past the point of thinking about what note comes next and which pedal to press, like that's all locked in. But are you thinking about emotion, or like what what's that experience like? Like I know for me, if I'm playing sports, that's what I'm most familiar with. Like when I'm really familiar with something, like it kind of is an emotional thing of like, how do I feel? How does my opponent feel? Like how do I take advantage of what I'm feeling and leverage that based on what my opponent's feeling? But yeah, just what's that sensation like? Just being in flow state with music for you?
It's really seeing bigger and bigger chunks, I think. And once you're at a state of mastery, it's like every couple minutes is like one chunk that you're just experiencing. It's like, it's not like you're performing it, it's like it's kind of performing you. And you're just kind of there to experience it, and you're able to just take bigger and bigger breaths, and you're able to just think of it in a larger and larger context, to the point where it's almost like, oh, I started and then here's where I'm finishing. It's no longer the micro, so much, because it's so mastered that you can just kind of flow with it. Yeah.
Does time feel fast or slow for you at that point?
Definitely slow. Yeah.
Slow. That's cool.
But there's also an element of stress depending on if I'm performing, which slows it down more.
Yeah. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is cool how like you can practice a million times, but I mean, for me, it's sports. Come game time, it's just different. You know, like once the results actually matter, once this rendition right now, right here, has implications. It just changes the mind state, but it's the same if you're performing. But what do you have any goals? Do you just want to study Chopin for the fun of it? Do you want to perform it on stages? Do you want to release your own albums of his work with your performance, or or are you just sort of figuring it out as you go? Where are you thinking about going with it?
Oh no, just for fun. Yeah, just for fun for sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. So you've got fitness, you've got the memory stuff, and actually, before I switch topics, how has memory training changed the way that you study music? I mean, I'm sure you've talked to other people who study music having not done memory training in the past, but do you think it makes it different? Do you use more of that visual spatial memory for music uptake as you're learning it, or just, yeah, speak on that.
So one thing that's interesting that I've discovered for memorizing music is that our brain very heavily links each piece of music to the next. So each phrase links to the next. So if I sang like a line of a song to you, you might be able to sing the next line. Whereas if I said randomly, like, what's the last line of this song, or what's a line like this far through of this song, it'd be really hard to access it, right? So a lot of music is accessed in our memory based on the links we have to whatever comes right before it. And so one of the things that I like to do to memorize a piece is to just get familiarity with playing it in different starting points and from different points of context. So like rather than always playing it from start to finish or from the start of a measure to the end of the measure, practicing like maybe in the middle of a measure to the middle of the next one, and having more ways for your brain to be able to process it as if each point is its own unique part, rather than only looking at it in terms of start to finish, where you end up memorizing each part of the music based on what's directly before it. So that's one of the ways that I like to give myself better access to the memory for the pieces, for sure.
So you're basically shortening the chunks that are linked. So you're trying to link like each half measure to the half measure before it, rather than each measure to the measure before it, and just like establishing more links throughout is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. The
It's
more
interesting.
ways that you have to view a piece of music and the more access points you have, the better you'll be able to remember it, and also the better you'll be able to understand it. And so I practice in a lot of different ways where I break up the information differently. And that helps me to understand conceptually what I'm trying to do. But it also is another way to remember the music better. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So another example is like I'll just play the bass line and I'll notice the patterns of that. And that helps me from a technical perspective, but it also helps me because all of a sudden in my head, I can just hear the bass line and I can imagine the bass line. And so I have that on its own rather than only looking at everything together.
Gotcha. That's cool. It's just coming up with more ways to more chunks to cross reference, right?
Yeah.
That's super cool.
Yep. Because it's very easy to get on autopilot and just do it the same way again and again and again, but that's not very helpful.
Yeah. Honestly, yeah,
Yeah.
it's I feel like there's probably more resistance that you have to overcome because it's easier to just, like you're saying, go on autopilot. It takes less like intention to sit down and practice if you're just running through the same routine, 5 days in a row, 10 days in a row, 500
Yeah.
days in a row. But like to actually
Yeah.
have to like set a new routine every time, I'm sure that do you encounter that resistance, or are you just sort of at the point now where you're comfortable making yourself uncomfortable in those practice sessions?
Yeah, I think it's just kind of like a habit at this point. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Um, so going back a little ways, you said you kind of do the same things over and over again. If I ask you in a year, you'll be studying different books on the
Yeah.
same types of subjects. But I know neuroscience is one thing for you. We've kind of covered that with the memory. I know music is one thing for you. Fitness is another thing. So in an ideal world, you would hit all those things, I'm imagining. Um, is there anything else that you're particularly interested in?
Good question. Right now I've been having a particular interest in music that's kind of like consumed over some of my other some of my other
Yeah.
hobbies and other things that I'm doing. So it's a little bit different right now. Normally, I have actually in the past year or so, I've also been getting pretty into chess. So I think it's another interesting way to look at the brain. But one of the limitations that I've found is that I think it hits fewer boxes for me at the same time as some of the other things that I like to do. And I say that because like with sports, like you're getting the exercise component, but there's also like the social element of teamwork and meeting people and getting out. And with piano, there's the mental side, but also the self-expression side. Um, but what I discovered through my brief obsession into chess was just that it was like only one thing, which was like the mental aspect. And so it didn't really carry as much as some of the other things. It wasn't really like a compound exercise like the other things were, to kind of use that analogy. So anyway, that's where it's kind of narrowed down for me.
Do you think that if you like got to a higher level in chess, it would open up more space for the social aspect, the collaboration with other high level chess players, or do you think it could kind of get to that point where you're expressing yourself emotionally through your game, or do you think it's different?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, honestly, that's all. There's probably that component. I'd probably enjoy it more if I were actually pretty decent at it. It's very different from my other my skill level in other areas.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
that's cool. And then just to touch on that for a little bit, like, well, what when you were into chess, and you're saying you're not into it now, but from my understanding, you were a pretty high level player. But I don't know enough about chess to really say that confidently. But yeah, what was your experience like studying chess relative to your fitness routines, relative to your music routines? Like, how did that work for you? What kinds of things did you focus on when you were up in your chess game?
Yeah, I think one issue I had is my memory skills were like way overpowered. So I could just memorize like a full game after just kind of seeing it once, and then I just have it in my memory bank. Um, so I started relying a little bit too much on that, where I was like, I'm just gonna use my memory to become good at this. Uh, so that kind of held me back a little bit because I was focused less on like strategic elements and more just like I can just memorize all of this. So now I'm trying to kind of step back a little bit and just use that more as a reference point for me to have a memory of games and different things, but not as like my main strategy
Yeah,
going into. Yeah.
it's
So
cool. And then finance, I know finance is something you're into. Do you just kind of consider that like a means to living, or is that a passion for you?
I consider that definitely like a hobby, even though it's not.
Yeah.
um,
Where for you, this is actually interesting. For you, where is the
yeah,
line between like hobby and passion? Like, when do you know that you've crossed that line?
it's confusing because I've had like, well, hobby and passion, or hobby and passion are both pretty. I'm using this pretty similarly,
Okay, so
I guess.
what is if finance is a hobby, then what is music?
All right, fair enough. That's a passion. Well, that's because it has the emotional side to it. It has the emotional
Okay,
side.
the emotion.
Passion is
Okay,
like emotion. Yeah,
so hobby
yeah,
is time, passion is emotion.
yeah.
Is
I
that
mean,
fair?
hobby. It's like I'm having fun. Hobby.
Yeah.
Even the word itself sounds less serious.
Less sophisticated.
Yeah. But I mean, if you call it a hobby, though, it's like it's a lot less pressure. Like if I call
Yeah,
it a
is that
passion,
true?
I'm like, then if I don't do well, it's like,
Yeah, then your
shoot, it's
ego's
his
on the line.
passion. It's not his hobby.
Yeah.
The framing starts getting off. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But like going back to the finance thing, I guess when I was a kid, I was like, I peaked early. Um, because when I was like 7, 8 years old, I was reading all these stock books. I read Securities Analysis, which if you know Benjamin Graham and Warren Buffett, it's like a classic value investing text. And I was like, I knew everything about like railroad companies and just like just random stuff, man. That's a thick one, and I remember just poring over that. My dad was like, "What's wrong with you?" And my uncle was like, he still does now, like wealth management. And like for my birthday, I was like, I want to meet with you and discuss stocks. So we went and like got lunch. So I peaked really early on that, and now it's hilarious because I talk about it and like, no one please. I'm like, yeah, no, when I was younger, like, because I have all these investing books. And they're like, oh, did you get into it? I was like, no, like that's kind of an old interest. Like,
Yeah.
like I'm kind of over it now.
Do you remember your SpongeBob phase? Well, that was what I was doing.
Yeah, no, I'm like in reverse. Now I'm like starting to watch TV for like the first time. Now I'm like catching up on. I watched Ted Lasso. That was good.
Nice. I've heard that's good.
In a while.
It's been on my list. I haven't seen it yet though.
Yeah, man, I'm going in the wrong direction. Maybe it's even worse. Now that I need those skills, I'm not focused on it.
I don't know. I always struggle to differentiate right from wrong. To be honest, it's I don't know. Who's to say what's the right thing to focus on?
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, cool, man. I feel like we've covered a wide spectrum of things here, but I like the way that they're all connected, and it seems to come down to like I like that emotional, like when we're separating hobbies from passions and the emotions, the component. I think it's pretty cool how you kind of get to that emotional level with things that you're really deep into. And it's not easy. Like it takes years and years of deliberate practice to get to that point where you can like emotionally express yourself, whether it's on the soccer field, whether it's, at the piano. But yeah, man, it's just cool to see you get deeper and deeper into these passions and to see your emotional investment in them. It's been cool for me to witness over the years, and it's cool to get your takes on them. But is there anything else that you wanted to discuss before we wrap up?
So much.
So much. But
just getting started, man. You're already cutting me off.
No, we can keep going if you want.
Well, the other thing that I have that's been in my life this past year or so since our last podcast episode, that's been my main focus. I've also been focused a lot on the war in Ukraine.
Okay.
Which I feel like is a significant enough part of my life where I should probably mention it like on the podcast.
Yeah. Tell me about that. Just full disclosure, I am ignorant of these subjects. So talk to me as if I'm a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old here. Just when you're
me. Well, I would say I spend probably like 2 hours a day at least, just like following from various sources and like reading updates from the Institute of Study of War, etc. So that's kind of a totally different area because we talked about like just like fitness and different things we're interested in.
Yeah.
But that's been something that I've been like really focused on. That's changed, like worked my thinking a little bit this year for sure.
Interesting.
So anyway, I follow that all the time. And
let's talk about that for a little bit. It's first of all, just explain to me your sources and like how you decide which sources to view information from internally, how you vet them or don't. But just since that's one thing I've always struggled with. Like I literally see stuff on Instagram about the war. That's like the extent of my knowledge on these subjects. So I'm just curious. And I see all that kind of knowing like this is all bullshit. Like this is like someone's opinion of someone else's opinion of someone else's opinion. So like, how do you differentiate when you're getting down from the root from when you're just sifting through bullshit, like personally?
Yeah. So I have certain experts and commentators that I think are smart that I do kind of outsource stuff to. So it's not like all me trying to find like the raw footage or like the satellite footage and
Yeah.
everything. I have certain like people and accounts that I follow that I think are pretty good. And I also have a component of things that I like do look into on myself, like on my own. But yeah, it is really difficult for sure. But I can kind of tell, like based on the sophistication level of the analysis, how much the person has really put into, just based on like the things that they're saying and the sources that they end up using and the level of sophistication, where you can pretty quickly tell like, okay, this guy's pretty smart and he's probably not just BSing this
Yeah.
talk right now. So like Michael Clarke, I think, is a pretty good expert. Like Karoun he's a YouTube channel that it is just on YouTube, but he's fairly smart and has pretty good in-depth analysis. And then the for the Study of War, they have like reports and updates that are really interesting. So those are a couple of sources, of like main sources that I'll like look into. But yeah, it's hard because the mainstream media is very misleading sometimes, and it's not helpful because like if they're all kind of like pushing a certain narrative, then the general public has like a huge blind spot because most people are just following like the top organizations. So it does
And
become
so
tricky.
when you say you're looking for a certain level of sophistication, like what kinds of signals do you represent high level sophistication? Like obviously it's not just like the use of big words and stuff like that. Like, so how do you, like, what kinds of boxes are you looking to check, or which kind of boxes are like automatically like, oh, this is booty? Like what kind, like, is it like the quality of thought, or is it if it checks out with other information that you've kind of established for yourself as valid?
Yeah,
Like,
I would say like the level of detail, the quality of thought, whether or not it's realistic, or if it's over optimistic. And so a lot of pieces like in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, were really pushing how Ukraine defeated Russia like in the start of the war by like just preventing them from taking over. Um, and what ended up happening is they swung a little bit too far because they were like, "Oh, Ukraine stopped Russia and is so great and heroic, and like the Russian army is like has no chance because they're so innovative and they're so creative." But then they ended up in the direction where there was like a little bit of overconfidence, where suddenly like the underdog was they were treating it like Ukraine's way better. Um, which in many ways there's like evidence for that, but it's just not like it's not that rosy of a picture. And so depending on the expert you listen to, I feel like a lot of people will be painting kind of this rosy view, and part of that is like in a moral sense where it's like obviously they want Ukraine to win, so they don't want to say something that's bad news. Um, but at the end of the day, then you end up having like unrealistic expectations, and that doesn't actually help very much. So,
gotcha. And then again, let's say I have an 8-year-old's understanding of what's going on in the war. Can you catch me up on real quick on like what the conflict is about, the progression of things since the conflict began, and then global implications for what's going on there right now?
yeah, sure. Yeah, just give me a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, basically, Russia invaded a couple of years ago, for like February 2022, and they just attacked Ukraine. They tried to take over the capital city, and there were a couple big battles, and they failed. And they were definitely overconfident, and it was a classic overconfident war move because they put all their plans as if they were going to just be there for a short period of time. And so as a military planner, if you just say, "Oh, I'm going to win this in a week," then it saves you a lot of work because you don't have to think about like how are they going to be fed, how are we going to keep supplying them with more oil and gas and bullets, etc. And so they were trying to like think about this sort of blitzkrieg sort of victory, but Ukraine had this really staunch defense, and has continued to have this really strong defense of their country. And so I think this partially led to overconfidence that I was telling you about, of like the initial pushing back the initial wave was then seen as like, oh, the Russians are like very incompetent, they're not going to win this war. So that was like the first kind of phase where the battle lines were shifting a lot, Ukraine taking back land, and then eventually it led into more of like a gridlock sort of situation. Um, but this is also very misleading. So people say like, oh, it's like it's becoming kind of a frozen conflict. But that's only the case because Ukraine doesn't have like the ammunition and the weapons that like the US could just send them tomorrow to change that state of affairs. So it's like it's something within the control of the West where like we could do more to support and to advance the situation, but because we're not doing that, they've been kind of forced to like ration their ammunition and just hold these defensive lines. So now it's more of like a deadlock situation, with neither side making huge gains. And it looks like it'll just grind on, unfortunately, for years and years to come. So that's the sad kind of background and update. And another component of it is nowadays it's much easier to defend than attack in some ways, partly because of minefields. And so after the initial advance, Russia, one of their generals, Surovikin, he had like what was called the Surovikin line, and they just put dense minefields and they pulled back their troops. And the issue is it's really hard to breach a minefield that's like 20 miles deep. And even if you can breach through it, it's a lot of it has to do with time, because by the time that you mass your people to try to breach the mines and clear every single mine, then they can already like radio in artillery and they can spot your position with a drone. And so it just slows people down to the point where it's not feasible to advance because then their position's revealed. So it is very much like kind of a deadlock due to some of those technological factors as well.
Interesting. And then, what would you say the global implications are of this war, like in this gridlock state, and then also if it went one way or the other, post gridlock state?
Yeah, so they're huge, and it's kind of a crazy situation to be in, because for the average person that's not thinking about it, um, the amount of money like the average American would spend in their tax dollars to support Ukraine is like incredibly small, but it has such a big impact on global security, um, because it's basically just like it's just deciding like, do we allow any country to just take over another country with no warning, and do we just let that happen and do nothing? And so it's kind of like looking at what does the 21st century world look like, and is that something that still happens where there's like wars of conquest, and is that something that like the rest of the world just allows, or is that something that we stop and we stand against? And so that's kind of, I'd say that's like the overall significance from like a philosophical perspective. um, but then also from like a national security perspective, if they were to lose, it becomes a lot harder in some ways for the West, because it just pushes like our flank against Russia a little bit closer to Europe, and then we have to build up our defenses against that, which ends up costing us more money than just like a preventative sort of measure in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I want to go back a little bit to that sort of philosophical divide you were mentioning of like, should we just allow global conquests or conquests elsewhere in the world? Like, do you think that kind of is at all related to the core values that divide party lines?
Yeah, so I see kind of what you're getting at as far as
Yeah.
like, you mean like, should we intervene at all, or should we just kind of stay like focused on our own interests, kind of?
Yeah. Do you think like one stance on that question is correlated with if they're more left wing or right wing?
Yeah. So I would say, I'd say it's complicated because in some ways, like the right wing perspective is we should be like America first, and we should just worry about us, and whatever happens to other countries is whatever happens. But also, the right is also the party of Reagan, and it's also the party of like fighting against the Russians in the Cold War. And so that's where there's kind of like there's multiple layers to it. And then on the left, there's a proportion of people I think as well that are like focused on being more U.S. centric. But there's also, for most Democrats, they have an enhanced ability to experience like empathy, and the particular module in their brain that's focused on care versus harm is a lot stronger than it is on the right. And so looking at these countries as like a victim of an attack or being taken over is something that would affect like the left's response as well, wanting to be more supportive in helping the country. So I think there's a mix of factors that pull people different ways on both sides.
And that aspect of the left's mindset that you're getting at here, is that's like a biological thing? Is that genetic?
Yeah, so if you look at Jonathan Haidt has a really good book on this called The Righteous Mind, and he breaks down for both the right and the left what cognitive traits they have in a specific amount compared to each other. And so on the left, where it's a little bit more sensitive to like care, harm, like cleanliness versus uncleanliness is another module they have. Like loyalty versus disloyalty is like a little bit more of something for the right. Fairness versus cheating is also like another module. And so he calls them like these pillars of morality. And we all have them, but in different amounts.
Interesting. And is that innate or is that learned? Does
It's
what does
innate.
hate
It's
art?
innate.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's innate because it's based on evolution. And so one of them, which is like cleanliness versus uncleanliness, our sensitivity to that is based on being in a tribe and somebody's sick. If you had a natural aversion to like something that was unclean or something that looked like somebody was like sick, then you'd stay away from it or you would dislike it, and then that would kind of keep you alive. So each one of the modules has kind of a basis in how it helps you survive as an individual or as part of a tribe to help your tribe survive.
Interesting.
Yeah. So like
Um,
the loyalty one or the fairness and cheating one would help. It might not necessarily help you survive all the time, but it would, if you had that module along with other people, then your tribe would be an effective tribe, and that would let you survive on the group
yeah.
level.
Are are these modules like mutually exclusive to an extent? Like if the cleanliness versus disgust first, and then the cheating versus fairness, is that like, are they correlated with each other, or is sort of each one a separate thing that every individual has their own balance of?
So yeah, it's like a spectrum um, of how much like you care about something being fair versus you perceive it as somebody's
Mhm.
cheating. Um, and for each person, it differs. And there's actually a test online you can take that'll show you where you stand in each area. And
That's
it
cool.
normally will correspond with your political party. And they actually make you like type in what your party is and they add it to the data. And that's part of why they were able to figure out the conservative versus the Democrats, like what their modules were.
Interesting. And then just to kind of rephrase my last question, what I'm really trying to get at is like, you're mentioning five different modules, right? That's what hate has.
Yeah, like the
This
like
right, and then
pillars
but we've just
modules.
got
Yeah.
pillars.
And each
And
pillar
then
has like
there's
the duality. So like fairness, cheating. Yep.
each end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
But we only have two political parties, or two primary political parties in the United States right now. So it's like, is the balance of those five different pillars correlated? Is one pillar correlated with the other four? And that kind of, since it seems like we've got two buckets to separate the balance of these five different pillars, but so is all conservative people generally on like the same sides of all five pillars, and all liberal people are on the other side of those five pillars, or is it different than that? Am I oversimplifying?
Yeah, I think it's like everybody has their own, and whichever matches best,
Okay.
closest to their party is like where they end up.
Then you have to jump
And that's
all the
one.
way
I
in
mean,
that
I think
bucket.
that's one of the problems with like having a two-party
Two-party.
system is
Yeah.
it doesn't reflect like the vast majority of people in their specific days. Yeah, there is a
Interesting.
book actually about that I read one time, like a couple years ago, and it was saying how like no one's actually average. And the example they gave was they designed this cockpit, and it was like the average of like people's heights and their limbs and everything. And they, for whatever reason, they thought like just doing the mean was the best idea to like design this thing. And they found like, no one's actually, that person doesn't even exist. You're just like crunching the numbers and you're coming up with like what an average is, but they couldn't find like a single person where the cockpit was like ideal for them. And they were like, wow, we would have been better off like if we hadn't just split this like right in the middle, because there's no one here. But that's how I feel about with the two-party system, is like you're trying to cater to everyone a little bit. But you end up with like like the cockpit where it's like, is there really like anybody that's here in this? Does this hypothetical person exist where you're actually like coming together on every single one of these issues? So.
Yeah, that's honestly, that's the heart of what I was trying to get at. So with the conflict in Ukraine, are you interested? Have you researched the Palestine-Israel conflict as well? Or are you more focused on the Ukraine-Israel, or the Ukraine-Russia?
I stay on top of like a lot of events right now. So that's part of why I thought I would just like add it to the discussion, because it's been top of mind for sure.
Yeah. I'm really glad you did, since this is interesting, but this is not the kind of thing I think about. So that's why I wasn't steering the conversation in this direction. But
Yep.
Could you give me a quick rundown too on the Palestine, Israel, just what's going on from what you've understood, and the global implications of that as well? And maybe let's also, after all that, the similarities and differences, and with the Russia Ukraine.
Yeah, I would not be the person to ask, really.
Yeah.
The level of detail and obsession that I've had on Ukraine specifically is like far outweighs.
What is it
just
about
as
the Russia Ukraine that draws your interest specifically?
I think during the opening stages of the war, I felt like it was the most obvious example of like a clear evil to respond to. Because I think a lot of situations will be complicated, or they'll be a little bit like unrelated to me, as far as like, which sounds bad, but it is true. Like conflicts that like happen across the world that like you don't know anything about the country, the people involved, like you're just less invested in. So it just seemed like a very obvious like infraction, evil situation, that was like very closely related to like me personally. I have some friends like in Ukraine, like whose whole neighborhoods like just bombed, and they're just like completely in rubble. So like for me, it was just like a very like morally unambiguous situation. and it like shocked me. And so that's kind of what prompted that.
Do you still feel that way after the years of the conflict? Do you still feel like it's a clear lines of evil and
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah.
interesting?
So, but I also understand like it's tough thinking about as well, like how scary it is for like for the government to have so much power, like in Russia, where they end up conscripting people like forcibly into the military, and it's like totally not their fight, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't want to be there. Um, and that's where it gets hard. Just looking at like what is the average soldier responsible for, but of course they could always defect, um, and many do, and
Yeah.
they're surprised like how well they're treated in Ukraine, because it's like way better than just being in a military unit in Russia. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, POW camps actually like way more respectful than just being in our unit. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's complicated since they probably have to leave families behind and their whole life. Interesting. So before I segue out of this conversation, is there anything else that so it seems like in your average day, you practice music, you do your training session, you study the wars. What other kinds of things occupy your interest, or have we kind of hit the main
Yeah.
pillars?
So I would say the main thing is like my business, LB Memory, coaching people for their memory. And I mentioned the three groups, like language students, medical school students, older adults trying to improve their memory, who want something effective where they can work on exactly what they need to, whether it's like names and faces, key information, passwords, whatever it is. So that's like the main thing is that business. Um, and then kind of sprinkled in aside from that is like fitness, music, some of these current events types topics, and talking with my friends, and texting you pictures of random things and workout videos of me doing my Bulgarian squats. That's I pretty much encapsulates it. So,
and then just to touch on your business real quick.
Yep.
How did you come to those three segments? You've got medical school, language, and then elderly. Is that just from a pragmatic business perspective? Like, you think those are the three most profitable groups, or do you think that's where the techniques apply the best, or is that who you like to work with the best, or some combination?
Definitely a combination. So medical school students, it's super effective and it's something they need, and it'll save them tons of time. They'll get better grades. They're already spending so much money on medical school. Why not just crush it and know how to memorize stuff instantly? So that's an obvious one. Language students, I skipped 4 years of French and I started training people on the techniques. I got it into some of the local school systems. They now teach LB Memory language learning techniques.
What was that process like? I remember the early stages when you were talking with I forget the lady's name, but it was the director of whatever.
Yeah, so I basically just like for all these things that I do for memory, like my own performance is totally my credibility. Mm-hmm. So I'll just go in and I'll be like, give me a list of 100 words. I'll just memorize the new words, and I do it. And then afterwards, they never ask any questions again. They're like, okay, like how do we teach other people how to do this? Yeah, mm-hmm. So it's very easy. I just have to crush it. I just can't like make a bunch of mistakes in the meeting. They're like, goodbye. So that's kind of like a lot of my presentations, a lot of my pitches. I just like show somebody something that blows their mind, teach them how to do something cool, and then once I've got them convinced that it's practical, I'll show them how to do it. So that's been my experience with the language learning. Also with medical school, same thing. I'll just be like, pull any diagram out of this book. I'll memorize it. And then they just pull the wing random out like, oh, all right, I got it. Test me. And then they're like, okay, it's legit. So that's basically like how I approached that, and how I approach my marketing is I just like show people and they'd be like, okay, it's real. It's not a scam. So yeah, so I chose language learning in medical school. We talked about why, both very effective, very useful. Older adults also is definitely a need. And I learned about this because my grandmother actually was spending money playing like video games on her phone to try to improve her memory. And she was doing Sudoku puzzles. And she was telling me, she's like, I hate Sudoku, but I do it because I think like maybe it's going to help my brain or whatever. And all these methods that are just in the public view as things to do to keep your brain sharp are just so ineffective. And it's crazy. Like every meta-analysis looking at all these studies on brain games are like, this doesn't really help. If anything, you get better at the game that you're playing, but it doesn't transfer to your everyday life. And so I'm like, well, you could just be playing Pac-Man instead and get better at Pac-Man rather than like spending all this money on these brain games. So my approach is totally different, and it's totally specific and measurable. So I'll say, Jake, you want to work on names and faces? Okay, last week you memorized 10 names in a minute. This week we're going to do 15. Okay, this week you hit 20. This week you hit 25. So I can give you an actual number of here's what you've improved in this area. Here's the brain exercise. We're actually working on that. We're not just going to give you some random game and hope that it like ends up magically helping your everyday life. So it's all very specific to help them with their daily life, memory drills, that sort of thing. And I'll meet over Zoom every day. They get an exercise sent to their inbox that they'll do. Depending on the client, they'll give me a long description of like how it went, and I'll check in. I'll give them extra feedback. So they get those brain exercises every day, and then we'll meet either in person or over Zoom to work on it. So my foundations program is kind of what everyone goes through. And depending on the segment and the individual, I'll customize it a little bit, make it harder, make it easier. But that's like 4 weeks long. And then if they want to stay on and keep doing memory coaching, I'll just keep making them better.
And then
I've had a client for like 2 years, actually. Sorry to interrupt you, but like I have had people like very long term. And it gets scary because they start getting better than me, and I'm like, oh, it's great. Yeah. I'm like, wow, like slow down on the homework. Like I gotta keep my edge here.
Honestly, I love that. I've had just one client really who's stronger than me at certain lifts, and at first I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have no credibility, but I just feel like mentally I was way more into it. I could still design workouts for his level, even though I couldn't actually complete the workouts the way he could. But it's awesome. More fun since it kind of like allowed me to expand progressions beyond what I would find on my own.
I have just a quick anecdote. Yeah, go ahead. A quick anecdote I have is I had this Harvard med school student who I normally give before and after tests to everybody, and one of them is like a word list. And I say like, how many can you memorize? And always it's like they'll get a few, and then later they'll learn the technique, and then they'll get all of them, and they'll be so impressed at how much progress they made just within the span of like a half hour learning basic memory techniques. So I had this kid, and he goes through the list, and he gets like 30 out of 30. And I gave him like a minute or less than that. And I'm like, so like, what technique did you use? Like, do you already know memory techniques? And he's like, no, I just read it. And I just like saw them all in my head. And I was like, dang. And so I was like, oh, okay. So that was the warm up. And then I give him one list with like 90. And then I'm like, okay, here's your before test. Like, I was like, I got to quickly up the level a lot for this guy. So he's challenged. And so then he got like 43. And I was like, he's really good. And so once he had memory techniques, he was just like, he just kept getting better and better. And I was like, dang, this is great. Like, we'll see how far we can push this guy. So it was just hilarious because like my before and after test, nobody gets 30 out of 30 like the first day without using memory techniques. So he just blew me out of the water. I was like, maybe you don't need this memory coaching. Like maybe you're fine.
What would you say the average is, just for a frame of reference on that out of 30?
Statistically, or in my experience? Like statistically, in your experience, we can remember like 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time, and it's like the rule of 7 plus or minus 2. George Miller's famous cognitive psychology experiment, 1956. I would say for words, it's a little bit more. because the words are generally concrete words, things that they can visualize pretty easily. And they're also, as they're recalling the words, it's possible that some of them are a similar category. So they start to come up with a couple more. But I would say, like, for the vast majority of my clients, it's like 10 to 12 is like, you're starting to push it. So like a little higher in the range, starting to push it. Occasionally I'll have higher than that. And then this guy just perfect 30 out of 30. I was like, do you take like a screenshot during the Zoom meeting and you're like, you got into the corner there? So it was pretty funny. And I was like, all my homeworks are going to have to be way upped from the baseline test. And that's exciting.
Yeah, I find that's the best when I have to push myself as a trainer to meet the client's needs. That's when I grow, you know.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, for sure. Because I got to the point where I was like, I'm gonna have to up my game so I can stay ahead. I was like, let me train so I'm ready.
Yeah, exactly. I remember with that one client I was mentioning, I figured out how to do muscle up for the first time in years because he was going for it, and I didn't want him to beat me to it. You know? But that's pretty advanced move. Like that generally takes people years to get to. But this guy, I mean, he'd been training, but yeah, he figured out a muscle up within a few months. Which is pretty high level. But where can people find your memory stuff? How do they get in contact with you?
lbmemory.com, and then click one of the many buttons on the website, contact me. It'll just pull up a little email to me.
Sweet.
And I'll see that, or one of the people on my team will see it and hopefully respond to you.
And people
that's the problem.
You do train people that don't fall into the 3 primary buckets, even though that is your focus, right?
Yeah, I do. It's just less common. And again, this is like, just like generally speaking, like the language students and the medical school students, there's like a pressing need, and it's like obviously very helpful. And then I think with older adults, there's some of that need as well, but they also like have more time. And so that's part of just understanding like who your clients are and like how much time do they have to complete the training, etc. So
cool, man. Real quick, do you want to switch to your other mic just so you can hear what it sounds like in the recording?
Oh my gosh. Kind of funny.
We were talking about this before the recording started, but he's got the chipmunk mode on his mic.
I have a nice mic that I was hoping I could break out. What if it might work perfectly this time? We'll see. I'll plug it in.
It's a Rode mic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's supposed to be.
Rode's gonna get some bad branding in a second.
Yeah, with all of the followers here.
All the followers are gonna be like, not gonna buy a Rode. You can mute, but you can't switch mics while recording. Look at that. Rode is saved. Rode lives another day. Their stock price won't crash after this interview drops.
Well, lucky for Rode.
All right, lucky for them. All right, man.
Cool, man. Well, enjoy the Super Bowl. This is Super Bowl Sunday. We've got Chiefs
really?
versus 49ers. Yep, it starts in...
When's that?
It's in like an hour and a half, so I'll watch that. I'm a little disappointed the Ravens lost.
I had no idea.
Sports.
Goes back to how we started this conversation. Wow, Super Bowl. Wow.
Yeah, there'll be some good commercials.
That's a big one. That's a big one.
That is.
That's the game.
Yeah. So
yeah, I heard a conspiracy about the Ravens' loss. Actually,
I know I want to
buy it. There's no way they were gonna just pass up on the opportunity to have Taylor Swift at the Super Bowl. They had to be manipulating that somehow.
Yeah. We Baltimore getting screwed once again.
All right, man.
All right. Well, good conversation, man.
All right. Good chat, man.
A lot of fun.